All right. Good morning, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me. A little technical difficulty getting started there. All right. Like John said, thank you for the introduction. My name is Scott Lynch. I'm going to be talking today about cybersecurity as it relates to space systems. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, as hopefully I will point out here momentarily. But predominantly the reason I put this presentation together was to talk about some of the risks related to cyber in space, especially as we grow into an era of um, space exploration is the best way to describe it. As we expand out into the moon and further out to Mars here in the next couple of years. So without further ado, let's get to it. So a little bit about myself, just to give some background here. Uh, I've been working in satellite communications for about going on 24 years at this point. I was in the Navy for 10 years. I worked in electronic warfare, which is basically signals intelligence and cryptography. And ironically, going on 30 years now thinking about it, I hadn't thought about the overlap of working with signals intelligence and what cyber would look like, especially from a security operation perspective. But those skills have paid off considerably in my current endeavor. And so we'll talk a little bit about this and how it relates overall. So like John had mentioned, I'm a SAN certified instructor for Security 555 Sim with Tactical Analytics. 23 years in the space industry. I basically started out cranking wrenches on antennas as a lab technician, and then moved into engineering and then operations of the actual spacecraft, controlling spacecraft, etc. Then I went into mission integration, and then moved into network engineering about halfway through my career. And the reason I did that was, again, I was always looking for a challenge. One of the things the military taught me early on in my career was that it's nice to have a change every once in a while. So I spent quite a few years going through training to become a Cisco network engineer, if you will. And part of this too is to kind of explain the building blocks that it takes to get to a point where I think you fully understand the front to back picture of a lot of how this stuff works. But again, became a network engineer. I was a network engineer for our company back in the day, which was Universal Space Network. They were no longer, they were acquired probably around 2014 by our parent company, Swedish Space Corp. Great company, great people, have loved working with the organization. Like I said, how many people have stayed at a company for 23, plus years. Recently, as of last year, I started my own company doing consulting in this area with cybersecurity and satellite communications specifically is one of the targets that we look at for doing a lot of our assessments and security work. But prior to leaving the company, I was a security operations manager for our global organization. So as you can imagine, managing security across an entire planet's worth of ground stations and facilities could be a challenging endeavor. So let's kind of get into it. Oh, and as a quick side note, I didn't mention this on the last slide, but there's a reason why there's an astronaut in the picture. If you look in the middle here, basically that's Charles P. Conrad. He was an Apollo astronaut and third man to walk on the moon, and he was the founder of the company that I came to when I left the Navy. It was part of the lure. Everybody leaves for certain things, and going to work for an astronaut that walked on the moon sounded like a cool thing to do. So that's kind of how this all started. So kind of leading into the idea here, I was sitting here looking at ideas and how to do an introductory slide, and I thought, what better way to start out 2023 with a comment from ChatGPT, right? I basically asked it, how do we rely on space? And this is the answer it came out with, which is kind of eloquent when you think about it. From the moment we wake up to the instant we drift off to sleep, our daily lives are intricately woven with the threads of space systems, highlighting the indispensable role that the celestial technologies play in shaping the tapestry of human existence on our pale blue dot. Kind of hard not to laugh about this, right? The reality is this is the world we've moved into. 23 years ago when I came into this industry, AI was a science fiction novel or a movie if you were lucky. Things have changed quite a bit since then. Get the slide changed here. So looking at ground networks and how satellite plays into this. Most folks go about their daily lives not really thinking about where all their stuff comes from, right? We look at grocery stores, we see the food on the shelf, and we assume, this is where I go to buy my food. not thinking in a lot of cases that that food was grown by a farmer or raised by, cattle herders and whatnot. So the reality is, when we look at communication systems, a lot of stuff relies on space today, especially when it comes to things like GPS, not just for navigation, but also for like time synchronization and reaching things like governmental aircraft, space, or ground navigation systems on ships, maritime, stuff like that. So there's a bunch of stuff we could talk about. I'm trying to compress this into 30 minutes, so I apologize if I'm kind of like slurring words here. Let's see. So here's just a quick snapshot. I probably should have updated this. Just as a side note, I did this talk at the ICS Summit back in May in a live audience. Unfortunately, we're not able to do that this time, but the reason I did this was I wanted to bring kind of awareness to the industrial cybersecurity side of the house, where a lot of the stuff that we work with in SATCOM is sort of an OT or operational technology when you think about it. But in a lot of cases, stuff has become more commercial off the shelf nowadays, which makes it even more entertaining and interesting from a security perspective. So looking at a snapshot of the industry, these are just some examples of companies, organizations that are working heavily in this area to expand. Right now, the space industry is roughly estimated around 71 billion US dollars, projected to grow even further. I want to say the last time I looked at this, there were 2,000 startups that were basically in the space right now, no pun intended, to actually bring something into space, whether it's a CubeSat or microsats, or take advantage of space systems in general. We're looking at going to the moon with the Artemis spacecraft coming out of NASA. SpaceX obviously is exploring and going further than just the moon. They've got the Mars missions in their sights, and then also we have this expanded usage of cloud technology and everything else that's going on with things like Azure, for example. Maybe you don't know this, but Azure actually has a concept built to handle space. They were actually looking to build data centers that can actually communicate in above the Earth's atmosphere. Also looking at just 5G. 5G communications, there's been a lot of talk about 5G. Not all of it's in a positive light, ironically. But realistically, when we look at the capabilities that 5G gives us, 5G is going to be in space. The bandwidth we can get, the throughput, it's just going to be there. And so getting used to these technologies and understanding how they work can be very, very handy moving forward, especially from a defense perspective. So what are we looking at as far as innovation? If we link back to when we went to the moon, and we've been exploring those entities, if you will, a lot of stuff nowadays has pretty much been centered on earth science, or exploring atmospherics, weather satellites, and stuff like that. Then the move back into space travel to get us out to the moon and beyond is pushing a lot of technologies, just like the original space race did. When things like the invention of Velcro and Tang, if some of you even remember what Tang was, we see a lot of innovation coming from the space industry today. They're trying to lower the cost to entry by making satellites that use very simple off-the-shelf technologies like Arduino boards. Even in some cases, some folks have actually launched a cell phone into space. We've seen videos on YouTube and projects that universities have done using simple high altitude balloons, where they've used a GoPro camera, right? So there's a lot of technology that's trying to push the envelope of getting off the planet and outside the atmosphere. We're also seeing IoT. The Internet of Things is a growing risk that we see on planet Earth that is expanding out into the space industry, and it's expanding out into space in general. If you just look at what's been going on with a lot of the SpaceX missions, where we're dropping the trains of satellites up there for the SpaceX internet, that I'm drawing a blank on right now, so somebody can shoot me later on that one. But basically, that is an expansion of IoT, if you will, from the ground. We're pushing the boundaries of commercial off-the-shelf technologies. We're seeing something that we hadn't seen 20 years ago, and I'll get into that here in a little bit. Also, this adoption of minimum viable product, I thought this was kind of an interesting point to make. It wasn't that long ago that NASA spent a ton of money, space hardening, space flight testing equipment. A lot of folks thought that was too expensive, but the reality was you had human life in the balance, and so you needed to test these things. We've pushed more towards this idea of failing forward fast, like I mentioned on the top of the slide, where we test a technology, and as long as it meets the criteria that we expect it to, We put it out into production, and then theoretically, as things don't work out, we have feedback loops, we go and we fix, we debug, and et cetera. We're seeing this with a lot of stuff, obviously, here on Earth. You can't push an update to your phone these days without something breaking. The same thing with our computers. The part that scares me as a cybersecurity practitioner and just as a space enthusiast is, what is the risk to human space flight if we are not being 100% sure that our products are going to work every single time? I'm not suggesting that it's not the case, but it is something we should be looking at. So here's a typical ground network communication block diagram. This is basically showing from the satellite on the left-hand side of the screen over to the operations team running the actual ground station and controlling the transmitters, receivers, and all the other equipment in between. The reason I show this is obviously a complicated thing. There are a lot of things that go into being able to talk to a satellite, everything from positioning the antenna to pointing it to the right place, to setting up the uplink and downlink frequencies, and then up conversion, down conversion of the frequencies to be able to pull data out of the satellite in the form of telemetry, imagery, whatever it is you're trying to get back. The reality is a lot of that stuff is important. And in some cases, it's not always done in the most secure way. I mean, this has been talked about in the news for 20 plus years now. There were cases of downlinks from satellites being unencrypted, and anybody with basically a handheld receiver could receive some of the signals. This is still true today. One of the realities we have to deal with is once you launch it into space, it's kind of hard to fix it once it's up there. There are new technologies coming out to try to help us facilitate fixing things once they're in orbit. But if you put something up that's inherently insecure, chances are it's going to stay that way until it either deorbits, burns into the atmosphere, or gets shut down. So your typical ground station segment here, just to kind of put this in more perspective, a little bit more high-level block diagramish. Spacecraft communicates with the ground segment, which is basically these giant antennas, or at least in our cases, we run some very big 65-foot, 13-meter diameter antennas to receive telemetry and send commands to spacecraft. For the most part, the operations center controls these spacecraft from the ground in the comfort of their control center, and then the telemetry, the data, the end product, if you will, ends up getting sent to the customer so that they can do whatever they're going to do. So think like Google Earth, right? If I have a picture that I want to look at of, I don't know if you've done this lately, but if you take a look at Google Earth and you look at your home address, you'd be surprised at how often the revisit time is over an area, right? I can actually look at my house. We've been here, I think, about 11 years now, maybe 12. And I can actually remember over the years where I didn't see my car in the driveway, and now I do. I'm not suggesting that, Maxar or whoever's doing the imaging these days for Google Earth is revisiting my house every single day, obviously. But the point is that this is something that we can use for navigation and for great purposes, like looking at our properties if you're a farmer, or if you're trying to build a new facility in a new location and you want to kind of scout out the land and see what's going on. These are great things. But again, that information has to come from somewhere, and it has to be managed and transported. So here's an example of the antennas that are used. In these cases, I've just used some snapshots. Everything that I'm talking about in here, just as an FYI, is kind of an advisory label, is available on the internet. I didn't take any pictures from any proprietary organizations. I did this on purpose, obviously, so that, you can see for the most part from the open source perspective that everything that we're talking about here is above board and freely available to anybody to look into. In this example here, you can actually see on the left-hand side of the screen, we have a big 13.5 meter ViaSat antenna. ViaSat is a satellite terminal manufacturer and operator down the greater Atlanta area. So go ViaSat. You can also see some examples here where smaller ground terminals, right? You can see here there's I believe this is a Marine, if I'm not mistaken. It's actually operating a ViaSat ground terminal. So this would be something that would be smaller, more portable for communications on the ground. The difference in the diameter obviously dictates in a lot of cases how far away the satellite can be, whether it's in a low Earth orbit or a medium Earth orbit or a geo orbit way out, stationary over some part of the world. The point of this is we need to have the ability to have flexibility. And so having different size antennas gives us the ability to reach out further distances, but also gives us the ability in a lot of cases to have portability if we need it in a smaller form factor for stuff that's a little bit closer to Earth. Now, we've also got some examples here of radio racks and the receivers, the hardware that goes into actually tuning into the frequency, just like your radio would in your car. Most of us now probably have satellite radio in your vehicle. Ironically, I remember when I started with the company, I was 28 years old. I was a brand new controller in the operations center. And one of our projects was Sirius satellite radio. Back in the day, we helped transition it across the equator when it would pass between north and south polar orbits. Basically, it runs in a figure-8 track, kind of what they call a Molinari orbit, if I recall. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, but I believe it's a Russian name. But the point was that we would track it for periods of time throughout the day. And so we would tune these receivers to the frequency, just like you would tune your radio, so to speak, to a channel, and we would downlink the data and pass it on to the control center up in New York. The rack on the right, sort of in the middle side, is basically a mix-up of equipment from down converters, up converters. These are all equipment that basically take signals in, and then they process them and turn them from a satellite image, digital to analog, analog to digital conversion, stuff like that. In a lot of cases, we'll end up with packets at the very end so we can transport them across the network. On the right-hand side, just another picture of a different example of ground stations that can basically receive telemetry. In this example, it just happens to be a station that I've actually been to quite a few times in my life in the good old Big Island of Hawaii. So looking a little bit further into the actual terminals themselves, if you look at where we've come in the last, say, 40, 50 years, right? Going back to Apollo, we kind of joke about Apollo was way back in the day. That was your grandparents or your parents, heroes of the day. A lot of the equipment that you see in this middle stack is stuff that we've seen from those periods of time, or, a little bit more current to the 20th century, or not 20th, but early 21st century. But we've seen that kind of pushed out of the way for adopting commercial off-the-shelf equipment, specifically stuff running Linux and Windows operating systems with Ethernet and fiber optic interfaces for network communication. We've also seen a push towards APIs, WebSockets, REST. All of this is basically API stuff. But the concept here is we went away from what was traditionally RS-232, 449 controlled equipment to everything basically being controlled on a network, which we took stuff that was reasonably fixed and didn't change a whole lot and turned it into basically a bunch of computers sitting on a network. Now, the reason I talk about this is from a risk perspective. When I came in here 23 years ago, a lot of the stuff that we had was very low bandwidth. It was easily managed with RS-232 interfaces. If you're not familiar with RS-232, it's a serial communication protocol that we used to use to set the settings on the radios and do all the things that a human would normally do when they push the buttons on a screen. But with the advent of the computer technologies that we're seeing with Linux and Windows-based operating systems being used, pretty much every vendor out there has been writing products to use typical operating systems. What's interesting to me, and I don't know if this is by accident and I'm not going to try to label anybody. If you'll notice, I don't mention vendors here. I'm trying to stay somewhat agnostic to this. But if you look up the manufacturers out there that make ground station radios, what we call baseband units, a lot of times they don't mention the operating system. All their brochures leave out whether it's Windows or Linux based. And I think this is an important thing for us to understand as defenders, because if something is running a commercial off-the-shelf operating system like Windows or Linux, you kind of have to know how to defend that, right? Because we're about to put something that can control a spacecraft potentially, or a human manned space flight, whatever it might be, onto a network that would potentially fall vulnerable to the typical attacks that we see that have been talked about by Eric earlier and Steph as well. A lot of that stuff then becomes the area of possibility, right? The legacy stuff, the RS-232 based stuff, would have been really difficult to hack. I mean, you could do it. Hackers have been playing with satellite communications for a while. The pirating of stuff, which I'll talk about here in a couple minutes, it's nothing new, right? The old school cowboy hacking way of doing things. But with the advent of everything kind of shifting over to your typical modern day operating systems, the sky's the limit, right? Because now we have to think about firewalling. We have to think about EDR. We have to think about logging. We have to think about scripting. These are all functionalities that developers love to use. Well, maybe not the firewall so much in the EDR, but the scripting and the different programming aspects of using APIs makes their jobs a lot easier, makes the interfaces prettier to use, and that's awesome. But from a security perspective, it does open us up to risk, and we have to identify that. What makes it even more interesting is when you look at cloud-based ground stations, right? So Amazon actually came out with a ground station offering. You can go up to Amazon, just like you can get an EC2 instance right now, an Elastic Compute instance, and build a Ubuntu computer or whatever you want to do up there, you can actually get a ground station terminal. You can register for it, pay, and basically launch a small satellite and track it and do whatever you want to do with it. It's awesome. It's impressive. It's a low cost, low barrier to entry kind of thing. But now we've taken all the onus of security and we put it up on Amazon, right? And again, Amazon does some amazing things. I've worked with some of these folks. We've actually talked with a lot of these folks in my previous job as these things were being explored. But again, we have to be aware that anything we move outside of the realm of our control is now somebody else's security to deal with. And so we have to be able to monitor that. Now, software-defined radio is a new technology, maybe not new. This is a technology that's been around for a little while. And I say a little while because it's been slow to adopt, right? The technology that's used in our industry, in the spacecraft industry, has generally been slow to move, mainly because, some would say, I think Eric actually kind of hit on this, some people just resist change, and that's true, right? But in a lot of cases, the stuff that had been done before was reasonably known, it was effective, and it was reliable. Moving into newer technologies obviously increases risk, and therefore from a CISSP perspective, we try to look at this and we try to assess the risk and try to give ourselves some idea of what we're walking into. SDR gives us the flexibility to literally reprogram the FPGAs or the actual microchips that are flying on the spacecraft to basically do whatever we want, whether it be changing the way it modulates or demodulates frequency, which goes back to my initial comment about having spacecraft that were built with vulnerabilities that you can't mitigate because they're in orbit. Short of sending an astronaut up, which we've done with Hubble, to do repairs, which is unlikely because of the cost. So SDR gives us a lot of flexibility. On the flip side, you can also use SDRs for personal use. So if you look around out there, and I think I've got some links in my, I'm going to provide an Evernote notebook link for all the research I did for this, and there's a ton of stuff in there if you're really bored. But there's a lot of SDR projects out there. You can buy an SDR dongle for about 25 bucks up on Amazon, and you can basically get a small antenna. And for some of the stuff that's unencrypted, you can pull down weather imagery from NOAA's spacecrafts. There's just a bunch of stuff that you can do with a little SDR $25 USB dongle. So definitely something to take a look at. It really is becoming the future of things. And why not get ahead of the curve, right? Here's just an example of a satellite that's actually using SDR. And the big thing to remember here is when we talk about orbits, geo orbit, LEO orbit, or MEO, we're basically talking low, medium, and high orbits. Geo is expensive to get to because it takes a long time to get out there. LEO is the stuff that's flying over the ground constantly every 90 minutes, orbiting the Earth, taking pictures for weather, imagery, and all that good stuff. There's a lot of benefits to each orbit, but in the case of LEO, 5G can be used because the signals can reach the Earth really reasonably efficiently, and the delays are not there as much. One of the very first projects I worked on when I first came to the company in 2003 was using IP in space. IP being a layer 3 technology of the OSI model is connectionless and therefore can be used to communicate using typical commercial off-the-shelf equipment out to space in general. We actually did a project where we actually have a Cisco router or a mobile access router flying on a UK DMC spacecraft that was developed by Surrey University over in the UK. So this was a joint venture between the Air Force, Army, Cisco, and Surrey University. I believe it's still up there, but the whole point was to develop the idea of being able to use our typical web browser to do things. And now this has been expanded on much, much more since 2003, obviously, as you can see here with this spacecraft using 5G and IP in space. I know I'm hitting you guys hard and fast here. I'm trying to get through these slides. So what if we lost access to all this? And I really want you to think about this, okay? Because a lot of us would be impacted, right? Communication for the most part, right? Remember, for us old folks here, I'm coming up on the 50 here soon. Most of us had long distance phone calls. If you made a phone call, like my father was in the Navy for 20 years, so we would call him when he was in port, or he would call us, and you'd have that whole hello, and you'd have that delay in response. You don't see that anymore, right? Fiber optics, undersea cables have made a lot of that not a factor. But also, if you think about it, look at the Olympics, right? The Olympics, when they were in London, I want to say a handful of years ago, all of that footage was backhauled via satellite to the US so that we could actually watch it actually globally across the planet to see it. And imagine that you're watching a live stream basically over a satellite. It has to be very low latency, has to be very high bandwidth in order to give you the HD quality that we expect. So communication is a big factor of this. Navigation is another one. We have GPS, obviously. There's military usage and civilian usage, but we also see across the globe, from a global perspective, that there's other countries that develop their own GPSs. The Chinese have developed their own, the Russians have developed their own, Europe has developed their own. Everybody's trying to make sure they can maintain control of the criticality of having something in space that can help us to locate ourselves. I'll never forget, and I told this story at the ICS summit, but I think it's kind of funny. My wife and I used to watch this show called Chicago Med, and there was this episode in this last season where they had this AI operating room, and this one doctor made a comment, and it stuck with me because it's one of those things that I hadn't thought about until he said it, which was, have you ever just turned off your GPS to see if you remembered how to go somewhere? And I was like, wow, that's pretty deep, because there are times where I've gone into Waze or Google Maps for places I know how to get to, and I still turn on the GPS. It's that whole idea of we're getting more information, we're helping ourselves to navigate more efficiently, get around problems like I-95 crashing the other day in Philadelphia. That's helpful, but again, we rely on this stuff so heavily that it does have an impact to our lives when it's taken away. Thinking about, even Gene, I haven't talked to you about this, but I was thinking, for a guy who does a lot of off-road stuff, Jeep stuff, what's the reliance on GPS and space systems when you're out in Moab or some other place like that, right? In some cases, maybe you're not relying on it very heavily, but people that go camping, I'm a sailor, I have a sailboat. Of course, I'm on a lake, so I'm not going to generally run out of, places that I can collide with and find my way back home. But if I was in the ocean, GPS is very, very important for maritime navigation. The same thing with emergency services, agriculture systems, if we're trying to plant crops and monitor the growth, surveying and mapping, right? You've seen people out doing surveying with a big stick using lasers. They're also using GPS, right, to be able to plant flags where things are supposed to be built, property lines are supposed to be drawn. Financial services, your ATM machine relies on time in order to keep everything synchronized, just like your network does. That time is usually provided by a GPS receiver on a thing called IRIG-B, which is basically a communication technology used for synchronizing time. All these systems rely on GPS. So if we took it away, what would that do to you, right? Not to mention weather forecasting. I remember early on in my career, one of the satellites that we were working with was a cluster of satellites developed by South Korea for weather imaging. It was going to be managed by, I believe it was UCAR out in Colorado, University Colorado Atmospherics Research Program, I think. So don't shoot me if I'm wrong. But it was, somebody made a comment that if those satellites don't send their data down to Earth, somebody's not getting their weather report tonight, right? That stuck with me. Those little things kind of go, wow, interesting, right? And then, of course, we got television and radio broadcasting now. And then, of course, space exploration. I mean, that's just like the cherry on top, right? All these things, if we didn't have access to space, what would we lose? So looking at the risk perspective here, there are a ton of risks. The way I look at it now is every risk that we've talked about up to this point, and probably throughout the rest of the next couple of days, is applicable to space, full stop, right? Nation state actors, criminal activity, supply chain, software hardware vulnerabilities, cyber attack, obviously denial of service, hacktivism. Somebody just gets irritated with you and they decide they want to take your satellites out. We saw a lot of hacktivism during the Russia-Ukraine war situation very early on with hacktivists. I want to say it was anonymous, I think, got involved with actually trying to gain access to some of the Russian systems and facilities. I mean, the whole point here is that if it can be done, somebody's going to try to do it, right? Ransomware activities could be a thing that we have to deal with in the future. Imagine somebody takes over your entire GPS constellation, right? I'm pretty sure that's going to make the Air Force freak out, or Space Force at this point. And then, of course, just physical attack, right? Physical attack could be things like jamming. It could be taking your ground station out, something as simple as a fire, right? Burning the property to a facility could cause denial of service just from that perspective, physically. So there's a lot of risk here. And this all has to be identified and assessed. This is why we work with security assessors and pen testers and blue team and red team and purple and all that good stuff, in order to try to really understand what is the risk here, right? Because if we're going to put a person a human being on a rocket, we're going to shoot them into space. I'm pretty sure they want to be able to get there and get back in one piece so their families can see them again, right? I'm not trying to make a joke out of this, but the reality is this is serious, right? And it is significant. And the amount of stuff that's in space right now, I didn't even get into space debris, which I kind of like didn't put in here by accident. Space debris is becoming a huge problem with the amount of satellites and junk that is floating in space today. Uh, so that if somebody was actually to try a kinetic attack, right? Like if you see here in this example, we have a trusted satellite, we have rogue satellite, and then we have other pieces in this graphic. If somebody wants to take a satellite out, how hard is it going to be, right? Realistically, doesn't have to be laser beams and missiles. It could be a kinetic attack, simply driving a satellite into another satellite or some other object, right? Once you drive something like that into the path of a satellite or any type of orbital object like the space station, bad things can happen. So this is a big problem. Now, kind of shifting direction towards cyber. Now, this is just looking at the ground side of things, right? But NASA, and I got to give a lot of credit to NASA. NASA is really, really taking up the torch on trying to secure this stuff. They are very, very transparent. As far as I can tell from my experiences working with NASA for the last 20 plus years, they're transparent in what they find, they're transparent in what they see, they're transparent in what they're doing to mitigate the problem. Probably because they're a governmental agency and they work for the United States. But the point is, I appreciate what they're doing by, putting this information out there for us to look at. These little snapshots here all came from the Office Inspector General report over various years of different events that have occurred. I will tell you right now, this is just a snapshot. There are a ton more. And as a defender, our job should be every day, just like it was in the Navy when I sat in combat and we were actually reading the daily intelligence reports to understand what the threats are. We should be looking at this on a daily to understand what the risks to our environments are and how we can defend and detect it. 2009 all the way up to 2017 here, JPL attacks, systems implanted, execution of code on servers, modification of systems. I mean, you name it. There's a huge gambit of things that have been affected here. Not to mention things like the commercial off-the-shelf stuff, right? Just looking at SolarWinds as an example, not even mentioned here, but definitely was a factor for a lot of organizations globally. So supply chain is a huge thing right now. The risk to the supply chain is high. We have to do a better job. Here's an example of two satellites historically that were affected by hackers. In this case, nation state alleged, I say alleged because they were accused, but on the unclassified levels, they were accused of interference on two different satellites, Terra and Aqua. I think Landsat 7. Picture's cut off. Terra and Landsat 7, both imagery satellites for looking at Earth terrain. This is Earth science collection stuff. Basically, there were blips, there were losses of telemetry, and the post-analysis or the post-mortem after action analysis of the systems were that basically somebody caused them to be disrupted and therefore were an issue. Supply chain attacks, I already kind of talked about this. This is going to keep going, right? We've seen a massive uptick since COVID. I almost kind of joked with somebody about this once. I said, it feels like everybody went to work from home and then they just started writing malware, right? Because it seemed like in 2020, all we saw was a massive influx of attacks and supply chain risks and vectors. One could argue, and this is going to sound like the old guy in me, that our constant push to be bleeding edge and running everything on newer and greater operating systems and hardwares is potentially leading us down a path of continual vulnerability patching, management, and mitigation. I don't remember it being like this, to be honest. I mean, it's great that we have all the technology, but it is pretty massive at scale when you think about it, what we're dealing with today. Now, ViaSat was the elephant in the room, right? So this just happened during the initial onset of the Ukraine-Russian war. This was an example basically where a KA satellite system developed by ViaSat, or actually acquired by ViaSat, if I recall, was basically acquired. These are modems that were used for ground terminals for communication. You could buy a ViaSat terminal to set up internet from just about anywhere. We've used them previously for places where we don't have terrestrial lines like fiber optic telephone lines, stuff like that, where we can actually backhaul data from our facilities. You'd be surprised. A lot of times we have to build ground stations in places where there really aren't people. And if there's not people around, we have a tendency not to have communications lines. Therefore, we have to come up with other creative ways to get the data from the satellite down to us is one piece, but then getting it from the ground station to the actual user is another. And so ViaSat terminals and things like it can be used in a lot of cases. In this example, basically, there was a firmware hack that basically bricked a lot of these devices, therefore cutting off network connectivity for a large swath of systems. Unfortunately, it also affected a bunch of windmills in Germany, if I recall. It was kind of one of those attacks that once it hit, it kind of spread. ViaSat was pretty good at coming out and mitigating it and dealing with it. But the point is that these are the kind of things that we can look forward to in the future. So, yay. Now, could this happen again? Well, here's an example of all these different rootkits, firmware hacks, you name it, that have happened in the past, not that long ago. So what are the odds that this stuff's not going to end up on a computer in the International Space Station or on the moon or in Mars? I mean, what if somebody ransomwares an entire ground network on the moon, right? If you colonize a location, I mean, this is impactive. You know, for those of you that might have watched the TV show, oh heck, it's on Apple TV. Now I'm drawing a blank because I'm thinking of all the TV shows I haven't seen, but there was a space program from Earth. It's not from Earth to the moon. Well, anyway, if you look at Apple TV, you'll see what I'm talking about. They've played a lot of these scenarios through in the sense of trying to understand what it would look like if you lost control of your oxygen generation systems, right? And other things for all mankind. Thank you, Gene. Great show. It plays through many, many decades of technology and what if scenarios. And I think it's kind of required watching for anybody working in space systems because it's kind of like what would happen if, you know, we weren't the first people to walk on the moon and stuff like that. So kind of cool. Now, another example of physical attack is GPS jamming, right? So, or jamming in general. Now, in this case, we actually had examples where GPS jamming was used against the border of Ukraine and Russia. And in this example, we actually had reports of interference in places as far as Finland against airports where obviously GPS receivers are used quite a bit for aircraft navigation and safety navigation. So GPS jamming has been a thing for a while. I mean, jamming, I was electronic warfare. We did active countermeasure, active jamming, and all that good stuff kind of explained here. The thing we have to keep in mind from an electronic warfare perspective is, you know, from an EW's job is to detect signals of unknown origin and try to classify and identify. Electronic attack is generally used to jam or misguide something that is trying to identify you. And we do this in a lot of cases on the ground with missiles when we try to not to get hit by one. We'll use, electronic countermeasures to actually try to block that, or electronic attack jamming, et cetera. But from a spacecraft perspective, it realistically, I don't want to say it's easy, but it's not the most complicated thing when you think about sending randomized radio frequency energy towards a target can cause interference. This is true of anything that has RF or radio frequency involved. The simplest thing to do is jam a ground station by putting ground jammers near the ground station. Obviously, these are things that can be detected and located. So obviously that's not a quick or not a long-term approach, but it wouldn't be unusual if you had a border where somebody actually had vehicles, trucks, heavy equipment that could actually do electronic attack against spacecraft or ground systems that are supporting spacecraft. Because remember, we don't have to necessarily attack spacecraft. We could actually go after the ground asset. And as long as the ground asset can't talk to the spacecraft, we still win, right, as an attacker. So we have to be aware of the physical security, the physical battle space, and understanding better what we're dealing with from that perspective. Like I said, there's a lot to this talk. There's a lot of aspects here to drill into, much more than you can get done in 35 minutes. Now, I mentioned the ransomware scenario, denial of service on the jamming of ground and satellite systems just a minute ago, hacktivism, physical attacks. If I shut off power, we have generators, of course. Generators only have so much fuel, so we have to take those things into mind. I feel like in a way this presentation was written by a CISSP in a way. I feel like it was like check, all the different things we have to look at. Some of my friends out there that are auditors, hopefully you're appreciating some of these discussions. But things like terrestrial ISPs, if somebody cuts fiber optic links, or if they take out the ISP, we're talking some doomsday type stuff here, but is it really doomsday type stuff? Look at what happened with the gas pipeline up in the Mediterranean, right? It was not the Mediterranean, further north, sorry. For my Swedish counterparts, I apologize. the natural gas pipeline that supplied the Nordic countries, that was basically theoretically broken in 3 spots and was leaking natural gas into the ocean. That's an example of, well, if somebody can do that to a natural gas line, what could they do to the terrestrial fiber that's on the ground, right? The submarine cables. Somebody could damage those, right? It's not like there aren't documentaries out there that explain that, during wartime and Cold War time specifically, where those cables haven't been messed with. So if somebody shuts that cable off, this was a great topic that what my CISO from my previous company, so thanks for the point, had mentioned, he was concerned that these are things that we should be thinking about. And I appreciate kind of thinking outside the box when it comes to defense, because sometimes we can't always see all the things that we're going to be attacked via vector wise, but it doesn't hurt to spitball a little bit about this and try to understand better. Insider threat is a big one as well. Obviously, having an insider that could potentially insert malicious code, network devices like USB, hot plug attacks, you name it. There's a great example, Richard Clark, who was one of the original Department of Homeland Security czars, worked under multiple presidencies, does some great lectures. If you're really looking for some interesting cyber stuff, check out Richard Clark's stuff. He actually had a talk that he was giving where he actually mentioned that one of the ways that they used to do assessments was, rather than coming in and just red teaming the heck out of an organization, they would sit down and talk to all the administrators one at a time and basically say, don't worry about your boss. I don't care. They're not going to come after you. How would you mess this place up? How would you break it? How would you hack it? And I thought that's a great way to do an assessment, right? Ask the people that work on it every day what the weaknesses are, what the issues are, and then take that information and build your defensive plan if you can do it. But at least you're helping to identify these threats, because somebody's going to figure out a way to slip things into your system. Our job as defenders is to detect and defend, and that is not the easy job, right? As Eric pointed out, this is a very, very tough grind to go through, but we have to do it. We can't just ignore it. Now, how do we protect this, right? I've been talking about all the doom and gloom. Surprise, everything we've been talking about within typical blue team defensive stuff, zero trust, network segmentation, end-to-end encryption, monitoring. My fallback generally for any company that I go into, whether I'm supporting a small, medium-sized business or a large corporation, is we should have a fallback location that we monitor everything coming in and out, basically north-south, right? Traffic coming in and out of the internet, stuff that's talking to our systems. There are tools, technologies. Sysmon was mentioned very heavily by Eric. Thank you for that, Eric, because I'm a huge believer in Sysmon for the Windows environment. Surprise, it's also on Linux now. So thank you for that, Mark Rusinovich and team. But also looking at things like lateral movement within your environments, using things like Zeek for security monitoring of network communications between devices. You'll be amazed at how much stuff you can actually see with just the bare minimum of having Sysmon installed and using Zeek on your network. It's shocking. Obviously, physical security is another aspect of this. What about the forensic incident response capability? Do you have the ability to respond to an incident? If you don't have the logs, good luck with that, right? My job in a lot of cases, the way I looked at it as a security operations manager, doing active operational security, is to make sure that we have the ability to identify a threat. And if we don't catch it, at least we have the ability forensically to identify what happens so we can kick it off the network and make it go away. That's the way I think we should be working in a lot of cases. All the other tools that come along that you want to buy, they're great. But if you haven't done the basics, you're kind of spending a lot of time spinning your wheels. Awareness training, to be honest, I never was a huge fan of it until I actually started embracing it. And I'll be the first to admit that was the wrong approach. Awareness training is super helpful with your users. They become your human IDS. They'd be HIDs if HIDs didn't already exist from a host-based perspective. But human awareness or user awareness is a huge thing that can be very, very helpful from a security perspective, because we just can't see everything, right? There's just not enough of us out there. Tabletop exercises, planning for breaches, testing your breach capability, asking your analysts, your engineers, your software developers, your users, how would you break this system? How would you kill it? How would you make us have a really bad day? Or as I used to like to say, how do we put Humpty Dumpty back together again? Can we? You can tell me you have backups all day long, but until you've tested it, I'm not going to believe you. Kind of pessimistic, I suppose, but that's the reality of it. Audits and risk assessments are a big key contributing factor or benefit to this. If we don't assess our situation, you don't really know. And in some cases, I can understand, trust me, I understand not knowing sometimes can make you feel better because you don't know all the problems and therefore you're not stressing about it. But you need to know about it. You need to get those risk assessments done. You need the people that know how to do these things to get in there effectively and efficiently and come up with a plan for you to move forward, because just ignoring the problem by sticking your head in the sand is not going to make it go away. Now, things we can do from an active perspective. I hate to bring up CIS or the Center for Internet Security, but I'm going to bring out SANS slides from this perspective. CIS control number 1 and number 2, what used to be the SANS top 20, inventory of hardware and software assets, full stop, has been on the list for at least 10 years. And we still can't do this effectively. Come on. How many people actually have an accurate inventory? I'm not going to hold my breath. I'll be dead by the time I actually find some place that actually has a full-blown 100% bulletproof inventory. It's a great thing to strive for. I think it's a doable thing, but it takes work and effort. Technical debt, retiring the end-of-life systems, operating systems, hardware. A lot of the technical debt that we have on our systems today is because those boxes cost $100,000 a pop. Maybe not in a small business center, but in a lot of cases for your ICS systems, space satellite communication systems, those radios are not cheap, right? They are very expensive. And you're going to try to get as much money as you can out of them. And I totally appreciate that. So we have to have a plan on how to deal with that. User awareness, we're to hit on. Tripwires and honeypots. This has become a favorite of mine and Gene's as well, because we both work together on 555. And this has been one of the ones we actually did a talk on. Honeypots and tripwires can just be awesome. So shout out to John Strand, Black Hills Information Security, for his initial entry into my brain, at least, of tripwires way back in 2010 when I took his class, his 2-day on that. And then, of course, centrally collecting your logs and analyzing them. Don't just collect stuff. Don't become a hoarder, so to speak. Collect them and analyze them. You've got the data. You might as well take advantage of looking through it. You'd be surprised what you don't know. I see things in my SIM on a daily that I'm like, really, Microsoft? That seemed like a good idea to you to do what you just did. So it doesn't help to just collect them. You actually have to look at them. And then, of course, Zeek. Zeek is like the light at the end of the tunnel. If you can get Zeek into your network, if you don't already have it, free open source tool. There's Corelight makes a commercial version. Hands down, one of the best tools out there. So I'm going to finish up here pretty quickly. Teapot. This is just an example. So myself and Gene did a talk not so long ago that basically talked about honeypots and tripwires. So being the funny guy I was, I put a honeypot out on Amazon and I said, hey, internet, come get me. This was 7 days of operation of using the Teapot developed by Deutsche Telekom's security group, which is basically T-Mobile as we know it. But basically 400,000 honey trap attacks in 7 days. Now, I will tell you, you don't want to do this necessarily all the time because this was expensive. This was about a $200 a month in Amazon. But realistically, you're not going to put honeypots on the internet unless you're doing research. My whole point of this was to show that putting something out there in a known IP space would take roughly X amount of days for it to be known and actively engaged with. And this is everything from SSH attacks, elastic attacks, people trying to gain access to Cisco hardware. A lot of this is going to be script kiddie automation stuff. But what was really cool, and I don't have it in the picture here, but if you scroll down, you can see the usernames and passwords that were trying to be passed. So it kind of gives you some insight into what the automation's using. Password 123. You're like, oh, cool. Maybe we make sure we don't have that password somewhere, right? So things like that are very, very handy. Now, CIS has been very, very helpful at supporting a lot of the growth here and protection of this areas, especially when it comes to SATCOM. I got to give credit to oh my God, I'm CISA Jen Easterly, right? She took over CISA not that long ago, and she's been doing a great job of making sure that there was transparency, especially with what's going on with Russia, Ukraine. And I have to say, from coming from the DoD or the military side and then going into commercial space, a lot of stuff is kept behind closed doors. It's considered classified. Ironically, a lot of the talks that I go to for SATCOM security, most of it's secret clearance or higher, which really sucks because a lot of the stuff we're talking about today, it's applicable. It's not classified. It's just, hey, we've seen it happen. Therefore, the methods and means were classified. And unfortunately, that information doesn't come out so that we can defend against it for most of us normal human beings that don't have the clearances. But in this example here, CIS has actually been trying to help us in advisories and giving guidance on what to do. And it's classic IT 101, right? Patching, secure authentication, limited privileges. I mean, it probably feels like as security practitioners, we tell people all the time these things, and it seems like a broken record, but there's a reason we tell people to watch your passwords, look at your encryption, look at your authentication mechanisms, because people don't always follow through, right? Organizations don't have time in a lot of cases to do the patching they need to mitigate the vulnerabilities, the risks, and because it's just a big job. And if we don't pay attention to it, it can bite us. Also, just to kind of final out the rest of the slides here. So there was a space ISAC that was just formed recently. ISACs basically are organizations that are kind of built towards industry, like there's an automotive ISAC. In this example, we have now a space ISAC, which is basically community-based, driven by aerospace industry, space manufacturers, ground stations, the whole 9 yards. That's looking at sharing of common information to be able to help mitigate some of this stuff. Here's just an example of the organizations that are partners. So this is a big deal, right? We've got NSA involved here. We've got all the governmental agencies you could ever want: Space Force, U.S. Air Force, obviously looking at different threats, vulnerabilities, and trying to come up with a plan on how to mitigate this. Because just looking at what Jen Easterly's perspective is, if a small business that helps support the government gets hit, that ransomware, that actor could theoretically gain access to a governmental facility through those weak links. And so in order to mitigate that, we need to help our smaller businesses, our medium-sized businesses, and our large aerospace companies to mitigate those threats by actually letting them know, hey, we've got your back, and we're going to try to help you figure out a way to fight this. I will say personally, in the last 2 years, I've had more involvement from the US government, the FBI actually coming out and actually asking if there's anything they can do to help. It's impressive. We didn't have that for a long time. So I got to give them credit for that, right? So where credit's due, right? Now, the Future Defender, obviously, if you're taking a SANS class this week, you obviously have the idea here. Blue team, red team is a mixture of both. We have our purple team operators. The point is, in order to understand how to defend this, we have to understand how attackers work. And so getting to know the technology being used, like whether it's Metasploit. Ironically, I took Eric's Metasploit class 12 years ago, and that stuff is still being used today in active attacks. So he's right on the money with this. Understanding your systems, inventories, understanding your assets. It's just, these are all things that are basic, but if you don't know this stuff, how are you going to defend it? Now, from a training perspective, getting to understand programming, scripting languages can be very, very helpful. Obviously, cloud, IoT technologies, all these things. There's just a lot of stuff that goes into defending a system. And if you're taking a course this week, or at least you're participating in the summit, you've taken one of the first steps in actually becoming a defender. Congratulations, welcome aboard. The last summit, I met quite a few very new to security students, and I'm hoping that this continues. We see this progress towards the future defenders of our networks and our industry. And on that note, here's my pertinent information if you want to reach out. LinkedIn seems to be where everybody hits me up, so by all means, reach out. Packet Engineer on Twitter, LinkedIn. If you want to take an awesome class on detection and using analytics and using SIM, SEC 585 is the class for you. Come over and visit us. Gene's going to be running that course this week, and the more the merrier. So absolutely take advantage of that. And that is it, John.